I used to think you could always tell when something was about to go missing, like the faint drag of a loose hem catching under your heel or the taste of metal just before a storm. But that morning, there was nothing. Just water running from the spout of my green plastic watering can and a bloom of violets too eager for the season. The truck didn't even make much sound. It just appeared humming faintly as it turned up the gravel path that still had my name on the deed. White cab, red logo. Two men in dark shirts, one checking a clipboard, the other sliding open the bay door. They didn't notice me at first. I suppose they rarely notice anyone who isn't on the invoice. I stepped forward, not hurried, just curious the way anyone might be if a delivery truck stopped outside their house. "Morning," I said. The one with the clipboard nodded without looking up. "Delivery for Evan Barrett," he said, flipping through papers. "That's my son," I replied. "What's being delivered?" He finally glanced at me. Sofa credenza accent chairs rug, all scheduled for the lake house. "This is the lake house, right? This address, and I'm the owner," he paused. "Ma'am, this says the recipient is Evan Barrett. Signed purchase order, scheduled delivery. Paid in full. He doesn't own this house." He shifted weight from one foot to the other. "You want me to call him?" I handed him my phone. "Try this number. If he picks up, tell him his mother's standing on her own porch wondering why she wasn't informed." He called. It rang, then went silent. No answer. The man gave the phone back to me, eyes careful now like he'd wandered into someone else's argument. I didn't say anything more. I walked inside and called the bank. There was a hold tone, a transfer. Then a voice bright neutral. After a few questions, the voice told me the house had been transferred to Evan Barrett's name 2 months ago. "Via limited power of attorney," she said. "Filed with notarized documents attached. It's all complete." I asked her to repeat it. "Filed and finalized," she said on March 3rd. That was the day I had driven Evan to his dental appointment in town and waited in the car with a thermos of soup. I remembered because it had snowed unexpectedly, and he had said, "You shouldn't be driving in this, Mom," while brushing flakes off my windshield with his sleeve. I thanked the woman at the bank and hung up. Outside, the movers were already halfway through the unload. A tufted gray couch leaned against the porch rail. One of the men was unboxing a framed print of a mountain lake, the kind you find in hotel lobbies. It wasn't even our lake. I stepped back toward the edge of the path, still holding the watering can. The sun had climbed higher, and the damp spots on my sleeves from earlier now felt cold. My hands smelled faintly of soil and metal. The younger mover, maybe mid-20s, caught sight of me standing there. "You, the gardener?" he asked. "Sorry we didn't know anyone'd be out here this early." I looked down at the can in my hand. Plastic, cracked at the handle. Older than some people's marriages. "I guess I am," I said. He nodded and turned back to the truck. No one questioned it. Not him, not the others, not even me. Because the contract said Evan. The house had new furniture, new owners, new prints on the wall, and I was just someone with dirt on her shoes and no paperwork in her hand. I didn't tell the delivery men to stop. I didn't argue. I just stood still like I had at a dozen school plays when Evan forgot to look for me in the crowd. Like I had in the kitchen the first time he came home late without calling, and I'd left the porch light on too long. The house behind me, my house had new locks now. I would find that out later. The only thing I did was pour the rest of the water out into the roots of a peony bush near the porch. A habit, a gesture, something to do with my hands. Inside the house, someone turned on music. Something ambient and glassy. I could hear it through the screen door that still squeaked unless they'd fixed that too. I watched the men carry in the last few boxes. No one asked who I was again. No one offered a signature line or asked to verify the name. Not once did anyone say, "Wait, are you sure this is right?" By the time they left, I had folded the watering can under one arm. I walked back across the yard I had seeded one spring after Robert died. There were still faint lines where I'd raked the mulch in even rows, though the grass had long since covered them. Halfway to the driveway, my phone buzzed with a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. I didn't call back. I opened the hatch of my car and placed the watering can inside, careful not to let it tip. The inside of the car smelled like faded lavender from a sachet I kept under the seat. A gift from Evan, years ago before candles replaced handmade things. I sat for a while in the front seat, keys in my lap. There was no need to drive anywhere. Behind me, the house stood still. From the outside, nothing looked different. It had always been quiet. Always been pale blue with white trim like a postcard. It just no longer had my name on it. I didn't cry. I didn't call Evan again. I didn't try the door. Instead, I traced the seam on the steering wheel with one finger and thought about how a signature can be written in the same hand with a different heart. That was the part no one checks. And some things once signed away do not echo when they disappear. I turned the key but didn't start the engine. Just sat there, listening to the faint hiss of spring wind pushing against the window glass. And when the silence settled, I let it. I used to think that if I made myself smaller, just enough not too much, people would stop needing to step over me. The kettle whistled thin and constant, but I didn't move to pour. I'd already filled the cup, though I couldn't remember when. The spoon rested in the saucer untouched, casting a soft, oval shadow over the chipped edge. It was the good china, or what was left of it. One of the cups from the wedding set Robert and I had picked out. The others had cracked over the years, or vanished. I looked at the paper folded neatly beside the cup. A list. Not long. Titled in my own hand before Evan moves in. The kind of heading a person writes with a little too much care, like the way you write "to do" before cleaning out a closet you've ignored for 5 years. Fix the valve behind the shed. Change the porch light to motion sensor. Buy more of that almond milk Chelsea drinks. Clear out the linen closet. The next line was crossed out twice. Remove old curtains from guest room. I remembered taking them down one afternoon when no one was home. Chelsea had called the pattern busy during a passing conversation so gently I almost missed the intention behind it. I had replaced them with a pale linen set, soft enough to look like nothing at all. That was the trick, I think, making things look like they'd always been that way. The garden hose behind the shed had been leaking for months. Not a gush, just enough to leave a darkened crescent in the dirt. Chelsea once mentioned the air near the back fence gave her headaches. It smells like basements, she had said. That was the word. Not mold, not mildew basements. A memory disguised as a complaint. So I knelt down in the cold, morning light wrench in one hand, rag in the other, and twisted until my shoulder ached. I didn't tell Evan. He might have said thanks. But more likely, he would have said it wasn't necessary. That Chelsea had a sensitive nose and I shouldn't go out of my way. Out of my way. That was a phrase I'd grown used to. The tea had cooled. I stirred it once just to hear the click of metal against porcelain. At Christmas, they brought me a tablet. Wrapped in gold paper, Chelsea beamed as she handed it over. So you can finally stop wrestling with all those file folders. I had laughed softly. They never wrestle back. But that night after they'd gone, I sat at the dining room table and transferred everything. Medical records, tax forms, the deed to the cabin on Wildridge. All of it scanned and uploaded. It took me until nearly 2 a.m. My glasses sliding down my nose, the room lit by the low hum of the dining room lamp. I felt like I was studying for an exam no one would ever grade. The next morning, I emailed them the link to the shared drive. Chelsea replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. Another time, she brought up a doctor's appointment in the middle of dinner. "It's just a follow-up," she said to Evan, "but I hate parking near the clinic. I offered to drive her." Evan barely looked up from his plate. "We've got apps for that, Mom. You don't need to involve yourself." I remember nodding. I remember chewing my food more slowly after that. I bought roses once. Climbing roses, pale, almost white. The kind she had circled in a magazine one afternoon while we drank tea. "These remind me of calm," she said. I planted them along the west fence. The next week, Evan stood looking at them. "She wants something different for the new place. Desert colors. Clean lines. This feels too nostalgic." He didn't finish the sentence. That same afternoon, he came back with gloves and a shovel and cleared them out. "We'll do lavender," he said. "It's more neutral." The word fell into the soil like a rock. I didn't argue. I picked up the broken stems one by one and dropped them into a brown paper sack. The cardigan I wore that day had a hole in the sleeve. The one Robert always said made me look like a librarian from a forgotten era. I hadn't mended it. It didn't seem to matter since no one really looked long enough anymore. Later that evening, Chelsea stood by the sink. "You're so accommodating," she said, not quite looking at me. "It must be exhausting." I folded a dish towel into thirds and placed it on the rack. "You learn things when you raise someone," I said. "How to be flexible. How not to ask too many questions at once." She smiled at that. A small, tidy smile, the kind people give when they're already halfway to the door. After they left that weekend, I sat at the kitchen table, the list open beside my tea. "Don't make too much noise." I had written it near the bottom. Not as a task, not even as advice, more like a reminder, a boundary I had drawn around myself, soft and invisible. Some people write lists to get things done. I think I wrote this one just to prove I'd been there. I read it again, then folded the paper slowly corner to corner press to seam until it fit perfectly inside the envelope I'd kept from Evan's first apartment lease. The envelope still smelled faintly of ink and envelope glue of something beginning. Now it held something else, not quite an ending, but a quiet change of shape. I didn't tape it shut. I didn't label it. Some things don't need to be filed, only folded and left. Some things are only heavy when no one else remembers to carry them. I had gone up to the attic looking for a copy of a book I thought I'd lent to Evan years ago. He had never returned it, but I had a second one somewhere dog-eared with a loose spine. I told myself it didn't matter, but I went searching anyway. That was the truth of so many things. The attic was dust-heavy and quiet, the kind of stillness that feels like it grew there. I opened one box, then another. Curtains I never rehung. A candle holder missing its pair. Then the third box, taped long ago with gray duct tape and labeled in my handwriting, Evan. Early years. Inside, the air shifted. On top was a piece of faded construction paper folded twice, a crayon drawing in green and brown. 2 stick figures, one taller with triangle hair, a house with smoke curling from the chimney. In a child's handwriting, the words, "Mom and me's real home." I traced the lines with my eyes, not my fingers. The colors had dulled, but the indentations remained where he'd pressed too hard with the crayon. The paper had been folded so many times the creases had started to split. Beneath it was a manila envelope. Inside the certificate from Evan's first academic scholarship, $1,000 from a local utility board for a science project involving solar panels. I had printed it on photo paper and framed it. The glass had broken, the edges frayed. I had meant to reframe it, meant to hang it in his old room. Instead, it lay there tucked behind a stack of outdated tax returns and faded PTA newsletters. Farther down, an RSVP card, a conference program, the one from the year Evan had been selected for a federal engineering initiative. There had been a press briefing, I had sat in the back row. Evan stood at the podium in a tailored jacket. I remembered clapping, though I don't think anyone looked my way. Later on the department's website, there was a gallery of photos. Chelsea stood beside him in the official one hand on his shoulder. Her caption read, "Representing the Whitaker family with pride." My name was not mentioned. The folder trembled slightly in my hands. Not from the weight, just the way it always surprised me how paper, when stacked high enough, could take on the density of a stone. At the bottom of the box was the album, leatherette binding maroon with gold trim. I recognized the pattern on the edge, the one I used to choose for every family yearbook. It opened stiffly, the plastic covers peeling at the corners. Page after page. Evan in mittens. Evan at science fairs. Evan on my lap in the yellow recliner that Robert had refused to reupholster. I had written the dates carefully beneath each one in ink that had now turned almost brown. The last page had been changed. A printed photo, clearly more recent, had been slid into the sleeve. Evan on a couch arm around Chelsea. A calico cat perched between them. Behind them, a wall I didn't recognize, painted a cool slate color. Below the picture, in Chelsea's handwriting, a quote in script font. "Family is the piece we choose." No mention of where the picture was taken. No space for anyone else in the frame. I closed the album, gently pressing my palm against the cover. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard Robert's voice. Not sharp, just curious. "You ever think we'll make it into the scrapbook years, Lo?" I had told him once, that scrapbooks were for people who needed to remember what they'd already forgotten. I suppose I hadn't realized that I would be the one looking in from the outside. I sat on the attic step with the album in my lap. The rain made a low, ticking sound on the roof, like it wasn't sure if it meant to stay. There was a roll of packing tape near the corner of the trunk. I tore off a strip and sealed the box again, flattening the edges as if it were something meant to be mailed or buried. I took a marker from the shelf and wrote slowly in block letters, "Archive, do not reopen." The ink bled slightly on the cardboard, like it had been waiting for something final. I recapped the marker, slid it back into its cup. I didn't carry the box back down. I didn't tell Evan I'd found it. I didn't mention it when he called 2 days later to ask if I still had the warranty papers for the dishwasher. I only told him where they were filed. I did not ask if the roses had bloomed, or if he remembered the color of the curtains in his childhood room. Some questions don't need answers. Some pages turn themselves. Some people never raise their voice because they've learned how to cut with a whisper. I hadn't heard of the cafe before. The kind of place with polished marble counters and single-stem tulips in vases that looked more expensive than anything I owned. Chelsea picked the table by the window where the light fell just right across her cheekbones. She waved when she saw me twice, as if I might miss her. The chair was low and modern, all angles. I sat with both hands around the mug. She'd already ordered for us. "Green tea, no sugar." "You look lovely," she said, scanning my coat sleeve. "That color's very calming." I nodded, though I hadn't picked the coat for her. I'd had it for 12 years. The lining was frayed near the cuffs, and the left button had been sewn back on with mismatched thread. I kept my hands in my lap. She leaned forward and elbows just barely touching the table. I wanted to talk, just us. Sometimes things are easier that way. Her fingernails were pale and perfectly shaped. I watched them tap softly on her phone case. Evan's name was on the screen for a moment, then disappeared. "I know you've been managing everything alone for a long time," she began. "And that can be a lot. Evan and I were talking, and we just want to make sure you feel supported as you age." She glanced at me to check if I would flinch. "We found a place," she continued. "It's not a facility, nothing like that. It's a wellness-based residence. Community-focused, very private. People your age thrive in environments like that. I traced a circle on the rim of my mug. You're talking about a retirement home. She smiled. They don't call them that anymore. It's really more like a retreat. With nurses, of course, and support staff. Evan was a little unsure about bringing it up. He thought you might feel defensive. Did he? She lowered her voice. He worries, you know, about how isolated you've been. He said you canceled your last dentist appointment. I rescheduled it. There was ice on the road. I understand, she said in a tone that meant she didn't. And look, none of this has to happen right away, but planning ahead is a form of love. Speaking of which, she opened her bag and slid a folder across the table. Smooth leather, thin gold clasp. I'd seen those folders before. Lawyers always liked them. So did banks. It's just a draft, she said lightly. Just something to review. It gives Evan temporary authority to help you manage some accounts should you need it. Medical financial only if absolutely necessary. I didn't touch the folder. It's not even binding yet, she added. We just want things to be simple in case anything ever happened. You wouldn't want the wrong person making decisions. I folded the napkin in half, then into quarters. Her smile stayed fixed. You don't need to sign anything now, obviously, but Evan would be relieved to know you trust him. Have you asked him if he still trusts me? She blinked once. Of course. It's just... Sometimes love looks like letting go of control. She refilled her own cup slowly. Not a drop spilled. Not a sound. I almost forgot, she said, as if remembering something delightful. That little place in Wildridge. The one on the ridge with the iron stove. Evan mentioned you haven't been there in years. It must be hard after Robert. I didn't respond. I hadn't said his name in front of her before. I was thinking, she continued. Maybe it's time Evan made some memories there. He's never even seen it, and it's part of his inheritance, isn't it? I reached for the mug. Not because I needed a drink, but because I needed to hold something warm. That cabin is special, I said. I know, she replied quickly, but Evan deserves to have pieces of his family history, places to return to. I didn't correct her. She glanced at her phone again. Anyway, no pressure. Just think about it. We'll keep everything in your name for now. We just want to help. That's all this is. Outside the window, 2 sparrows landed on the sidewalk. One pecked at something the other had dropped. They left almost immediately, nothing worth staying for. At home, I opened the old oak cabinet Robert had built, the one with the hidden drawer. Inside was a small cedar box, darkened at the edges with age. It smelled faintly of pine and dust. I lifted the lid. The top envelope had our initials pressed into the seal R&L. I unfolded the first letter. It was written in his handwriting, slanted and clean. If they ever try to claim it, show them this: that house belongs to no one but you and me. It was never part of the estate. It's a vow, not an asset. The ink had bled slightly at the bottom, as if his hand had paused too long. I refolded the letter, returned it to the box, and shut the cabinet. I didn't tear up the document from the cafe. I didn't call Evan. I didn't confront anyone. I sat in the chair by the window, the one with the faded cushion, and watched a single drop of tea darken the wood of the end table. And I decided that silence like land could be something you protect, even if no one else remembers where the line was drawn. Some exits don't require a door, just the quiet decision not to explain yourself. The pen left a slight groove in the paper where I signed my name. Nothing dramatic, just an indentation deep enough to prove I'd been there. Henry didn't look up when I passed the folder back across the desk. He tapped the papers into a neat stack and slid them into the manila envelope beside his glasses. "This won't take long," he said, "though it will be noticed." I didn't reply. There was a glass of water near the edge of the table. I moved it half an inch farther from the corner. The coaster underneath was wool, hand-stitched with initials that weren't mine. Selling the Wildridge place under a blind trust, he continued. You'll stay anonymous through title transfer. The main house will move through escrow with a corporate broker. They won't know until after closing. He paused, waiting. Is there anything else you want to leave with them? I folded my hands. One thumb rubbed the knuckle of the other. I looked at the watch on my wrist not to check the time, but to feel the weight of it. Evan had given it to me for Mother's Day years ago. The clasp still stuck when the air got cold. No letters. No explanations. I shook my head once. Henry nodded and stood. I'll call you when we're ready for wire confirmation. I left his office with the folder tucked in my bag, though I didn't need it. Every detail had already been copied, notarized, and sealed. I had reviewed the terms 3 times and committed the final routing number to memory. The papers themselves were just a formality. At the bank, I waited in the private client room. Jack Nolan came in wearing a slate-colored tie and introduced himself like we hadn't spoken on the phone twice already. His handshake was soft damp at the palm. His cologne smelled like cedar and plastic. He asked what kind of account I wanted. One with no paper trail, I said. He looked startled. I clarified no shared statements, no online access outside this building, withdrawals in person, no debit card. He tapped a few keys, then glanced up. You're looking for anonymity. I nodded. He adjusted his tie. That used to be more common. People hiding things from spouses. These days, it's mostly elder protection or domestic recovery. His voice dropped on the last 2 words, as if they required discretion. I handed him a cashier's check from the sale of a long-forgotten investment property. The memo line was blank. He didn't ask further questions. When I got back to the house, I walked from room to room with a notepad listing what I would take. The chair by the window, 2 quilts, my slippers, the enamel kettle. One photograph Robert, standing knee-deep in the river with a fishing rod, looking away from the camera. I left the frame, took the print. In the kitchen, I pulled down a ceramic cup from the highest shelf. White, with a navy rim chipped at the handle. The glaze had faded in patches from years of scrubbing. Robert had used it every morning, even after we bought a set of new ones. He called it the stubborn mug. The cabin I rented was small just enough for one body and the memories it could carry. The woman at the rental office didn't ask why I paid the full 6-month term in advance. I told her I didn't need internet. She told me the fireplace still smoked a little. I told her that wouldn't be a problem. I moved in during a rain that wasn't quite steady, just persistent. Enough to soak the hem of my coat and dampen the paper bag holding the few books I'd brought. The journal went in the drawer beside the bed. I hadn't written in it since Robert passed, but I brought it anyway. I didn't plan to fill it. I just didn't want it left behind. At the Wildridge house, I made one last visit. I unlocked the door, walked through each room with my palms facing down. The silence was thick, but not cold. The fireplace still held soot from the last winter we used it. I didn't clean it. I dusted off the mantel and placed the key in the center, a single object surrounded by nothing. Outside, I tightened the lock. The click sounded final, but not theatrical. There was no note on the door, no spare key under the mat, no candle left in the window. I didn't tell Evan I had gone. I didn't call Chelsea to explain the listing. I didn't write Henry with instructions for what to say when the papers arrived in their mailbox. I folded my coat over my arm and left with the chipped mug and a journal that hadn't been opened in 7 years. And I thought not for the first time that disappearance isn't always about vanishing. Sometimes it's just about no longer showing up where people expect to find you. I didn't expect the silence to have weight. It settled like a wool shawl across my shoulders, itchy at first, but eventually warm. The cabin smelled of pine and old matches. I boiled the water on a small burner and poured it over ground coffee in the only ceramic mug I'd brought. The handle was cracked, a tiny spider line of porcelain beneath the glaze. I remembered when it chipped. Evan was 6. He'd knocked it over with a Lego spaceship. I had wrapped it in masking tape for weeks before buying glue. Now it sat whole again, if only in structure, not in time. I wrote in the notebook I found wedged behind a kitchen drawer. The paper was yellowed, the spiral binding warped. On the first page, I printed slowly, Day 1. No one called. I didn't wait. Then underlined it lightly, as if even the ink should tread quietly. At the bookstore in town, I stood too long at the counter. Marla, the owner, wore blue eyeliner and smelled faintly of cedar. She rang up 3 paperbacks mysteries with faded spines and said, "We have a stretch and restore class at the library. Good for mornings. Free." I nodded. That was enough. Her tone didn't press. I liked that. Back at the cabin, I wiped the windowsill with a dish towel that had once been part of a tablecloth. The view looked out onto a ridge where the snow still clung to tree roots. Not pristine white, but the gray kind that refuses to melt quickly. It reminded me of laundry left in the wash too long. Soggy, a little sour. I hung up the photo of William that I kept in a manila envelope. He was leaning on the old truck, his collar turned up against the cold, laughing. The kind of photo no one poses for. His handwriting was on the back. "Remind me to fix the porch light." A joke. He always said that even when we had no porch light at all. At night, I stirred a spoonful of honey into lukewarm tea and watched the flame in the small stove flicker low. I didn't miss the hum of appliances or the vibration of text messages. My phone sat off wrapped in a scarf in a drawer, like a sleeping thing I didn't trust. A bird tapped its beak against the window one morning, probably drawn by its own reflection. I stood still. It tapped twice more, then flew off. I made a note, Day 4. Some things don't stay long enough to see who's inside. At the market, a woman in a padded vest asked if I lived nearby. I said I was just renting for a little while. She smiled, said, "That's the best way to live. Temporary things break softer." I wrote that line down too. It sounded like something William would have carved into a piece of driftwood and nailed above the back door. Once, I caught myself folding a dish towel the way my mother used to, twice lengthwise, then once across. It startled me how our hands remember even when our heads try to forget. One evening, I sat on the floor and opened a worn leather box of sewing notions I had brought out of habit. Buttons, snaps, a thimble, half a spool of forest green thread. The kind of green that doesn't draw attention, but stays. I threaded the needle and stitched the loose hem on my coat, even though I likely wouldn't wear it again until fall. It felt like marking territory in time. This moment happened. I mended something. In a second-hand shop, I found a small framed print of a willow tree and brought it back to the cabin. I don't know why. I didn't even particularly like willows, but the branches draped low protective. There was something about the way the roots looked, like they were holding on. I placed it near the stove where the shadows moved across it at night. Chelsea once told me that clutter was a sign of unresolved emotion. She'd said it in passing while helping herself to the last wedge of brie during one of their visits. Evan didn't respond. He just shifted the wine bottle away from the edge of the table. There are no crumbs here, no half-poured wine glasses, no almond milk containers left on the counter. Only the cup, the notebook, the stove. And the sound of my own footsteps, soft, but mine. The last snowfall melted by the 8th day. The trail behind the cabin grew muddy thick with prints from deer and something else, maybe a fox. I didn't follow them. I only noticed them. I'd learned finally that not every track has to be pursued. Someone knocked once. I didn't open the door. There was no voice, no urgency, just a single knock, then quiet. I sat with my hand resting on the table, a thread still caught in my sleeve from the mending. Eventually, I stood and slid the bolt across. Not because I was frightened, just because I could. That night, I reread a letter William had written me before our second anniversary. He'd tucked it into my gardening book, which I hadn't opened in years. You let things take root, even the wild ones. That's what makes you steady. He'd drawn a little leaf in the margin. Just one. I tore a page from my notebook and wrote, "Some houses do not need fences. Only the will to stay standing when someone tries the lock." I folded the paper into fourths and placed it beneath the photo of William. No one had come looking. No one had tried to explain. Maybe they thought I had given up or gone senile or surrendered. But silence is not surrender. It's just the sound of choosing. And I had. I never did like the sound of forced politeness. It's the kind of voice that presses a smile against the edges of a threat and pretends it's an invitation. The knock was too practiced. 3 quick taps, 1 pause, then a final tap, like someone rehearsed how not to seem alarming. I didn't move right away. I flipped the bread on the pan and turned off the flame before opening the door. He wore a charcoal suit sleeves, just a little too short, and carried a clipboard, like it weighed nothing. Beside him, a woman in scrubs, clean, creaseless, forgettable. Her badge said Patricia, but her shoes were too new to belong to anyone who'd stood on a hospital floor. Mrs. Winslow. The man tilted his head, expression soft, like a washed-out photograph. "I'm Dr. Randall Holt, and this is my colleague Patricia. We were asked to check in. A routine wellness assessment. Just a few questions, nothing invasive." He smiled, but his eyes kept moving over my shoulder into the corners behind me. "By whom? Your family. Evan and Chelsea, to be exact. They were concerned about signs of cognitive fatigue. Some financial confusion, as I understand it." He stepped forward before I said a word. That was how I knew. Real doctors don't cross thresholds without consent. Actors do. I opened the door wider and gestured toward the small table by the window. "You can sit," I said, and as they walked in, I clicked the recorder hidden beneath the linen runner on the shelf. I didn't look at it. I just poured 3 glasses of water and placed them down with a thud that said, "You're being watched." Patricia crossed her legs, not a wrinkle in sight. "Have you had any trouble remembering things lately? Numma. Difficulty managing bills or keeping track of dates? I still use a pen and a calendar." Dr. Holt scratched something. His pen didn't click. It scratched like it was carving in. "We're here to help, not to judge." Evan mentioned some challenges with signature discrepancies on financial documents. My voice didn't lift. "That's interesting, considering I haven't signed anything." He paused. Patricia handed him a folder. Inside it, a printed form. My name typed across the top. A shaky signature. The kind someone forges when they think the age will cover the lie. I didn't flinch. "I don't remember writing that." "You may have forgotten," Patricia said softly. "That's precisely why we're here." The silence after that was too long. I used it to sip my water. My cup left a faint ring on the wood. I didn't wipe it. They asked more questions, coded circular, preloaded with implication. Had I gotten lost recently? Missed any medications? Felt unsafe? I told them I slept fine and never locked my bedroom door. That seemed to disappoint them. After exactly 28 minutes, they stood. "We'll file our preliminary report. You may be contacted for a follow-up." They didn't ask to return. They knew they'd been caught even if I hadn't said the word. When they left, I sat for a long time. The toast had gone cold. I threw it out. I labeled the recording and uploaded it to a private folder before calling Henry. He didn't ask questions. He just listened. When I was done, there was a pause, then a sound like paper shifting. You did the right thing. I'll forward this to Detective Barrett. We've been watching Chelsea for a while. Others, he hesitated. 2. One in Montana, one in Pennsylvania. Elder care fraud. Same language. Same tactics. Different names. I didn't say anything right away. My fingers traced the crack in the corner of the window pane, the one I hadn't noticed until this morning. It looked like a tiny map of roads leading nowhere. She's not just manipulative, I said. She's practiced. That's why this matters. That night, I kept the lights low. I read half a chapter of a mystery novel and made tea in the chipped porcelain cup with the blue ivy pattern. The one from the old house. The one nobody ever wanted to drink from except me. I thought about the word family. How many places it shows up. Emergency contacts. Banking access. Power of attorney. The assumption that biology is integrity. I opened the small drawer under the sink where I kept things not quite necessary, but impossible to throw away. In the back behind the faded recipe cards and a single rusted key was the cufflink from my husband's last formal suit. He had only worn it once to Evan's college ceremony. I never found the other one. No one ever looked for it. I sat with it in my hand for a long time. It didn't shine anymore, but it was heavier than it looked. At noon the next day, Henry sent a message. Barrett wants a formal statement. You don't have to decide now. I didn't reply. 2 days later, the mailman left an envelope with no return address. Inside, a printed page from a legal blog, How to Protect Yourself from Involuntary Conservatorship. I folded it once, then again until the edges tore slightly. I didn't keep it. Instead, I pulled out the journal I'd been writing in. The page was already dated. I'd done it before breakfast out of habit. I crossed it out. Then I wrote, sometimes they don't come to take your things. Sometimes they come to take your version of events. I put the pen down. I didn't close the book. I left it open on the table where the sun could bleach the ink slowly, one letter at a time. They always warned about wolves in sheep's clothing, but no one told me what to do when the wolf wore pearls and spoke gently. I didn't read the article when it came out. The clerk at the general store handed me a folded copy of the Linden Hollow Gazette, along with a loaf of rye. He tapped the headline twice before placing it in my bag. I left it untouched on the counter for 2 days, resting beneath a jar of honey and a folded dish towel. When I finally unfolded it, the print was already soft with moisture from the cabin air. Local woman implicated in multi-state elder fraud scheme. No names, no photos, just initials and references to victims who prefer to remain anonymous. The mug I was holding had a chip in the rim. I ran my thumb over it and set it down. No one knocked on my door for several days, and I didn't expect them to. I woke when I wanted, wrote when I could. My handwriting had become smaller over the years, tighter, more careful, as if trying to conserve space I no longer owed to anyone. There was a sketch pinned above my table now, something I copied from an old seed packet. 3 carrots, still with soil, clinging to the roots, not perfect, but mine. I bought a few pots and sowed radishes, even though the ground hadn't fully warmed yet. It was something to tend, something no one else had touched. The first time I wore my wedding ring again, I didn't realize I had. I found it in the drawer with a broken zipper and an old bottle of vanilla extract. The band slipped on easily loose in a way it hadn't been in years. I didn't wear it for him or for what we used to be. I wore it for the version of myself who once said no when it mattered. I didn't know Evan was coming. No text, no warning. I only noticed because the car parked too quietly, and the birds didn't return to the feeder after the engine stopped. He didn't knock right away, just stood there blurred by the curtain. When he finally did, it wasn't forceful. 3 short taps, like he was testing the air, not the door. I didn't speak. I turned the knob and let the wood creak open. He looked like someone who hadn't slept indoors. Cheeks drawn in shoes muddy. He had a paper bag in one hand and something else in the other, flat, worn, folded in 2. No apology, just silence and a half glance that landed somewhere near my shoulder. He didn't come in. He held out the bag, then rested it on the porch rail when I didn't take it. "I know I lost it," he said, barely audible. "Not just trust. Not just you." He looked toward the trees as if anything alive might understand him better. "I'm not here to ask you to undo it. I just wanted to leave this." He laid the folded paper on top of the bag and stepped back. I didn't move until he was halfway down the path. When I opened the bag, I saw old photos, snapshots from summers at Wildridge, a few school drawings I hadn't seen in decades. On top was a letter unsealed. It began with, "You taught me how to be careful with things that mattered, and I still broke it." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't name Chelsea. He didn't explain. Just wrote, "I'll fix it." Not with promises. With time, if you let me. I didn't cry. I didn't sit down. I just stood there with the morning breeze lifting the corners of a photo, where he stood beside a pumpkin twice his size, missing a tooth, and grinning like someone who hadn't yet learned how to weigh a gesture. The drawing was folded inside a plastic sleeve. Crayon on construction paper. A stick figure with gray loops for hair and a red heart where the chest should be. The letters were jagged and large, "I love Mom." I remembered taping it beside the kitchen stove back when Evan's hands were still small, and his questions never had second intentions. I tacked the drawing to the window frame. Not the kitchen this time. Not in the place where things burned or boiled or went cold unnoticed. I placed it where light touched it gently each morning, where no one could walk past it without facing it. Marla from the bookstore stopped by later that afternoon. She brought chamomile and a book of poetry she thought I'd like. "Did you see the news?" she asked too casually. I didn't answer. She poured the tea and adjusted the blanket on my reading chair. "Some people come back only when they're afraid the door won't open anymore." I looked at the ring on my finger. It no longer held meaning the way it once did, but I hadn't taken it off. "I left it open," I said. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just handed me the cup with both hands as if passing something fragile that might still be warm at its center. Later that night, I moved the photos to a drawer. Not hidden, not displayed, just placed where they wouldn't gather dust or become spectacle. I wrote one sentence in my journal before sleep took me. The door means something different now, but it still opens both ways. And that was enough. I never told anyone when I decided that closure wasn't something someone hands you, it's something you carve out of what's left. The folder was smooth beneath my fingertips. I placed it flat on Henry Dalton's desk without ceremony. The edges were worn, but the papers inside were exact. No assets tied to my name, no fixed properties left behind. Only instructions worded with the kind of precision I'd once reserved for recipes written on index cards. 3 years, no debts. No co-signers, I'd said when he scanned the section about Evan. Only then. I didn't explain why. I think he knew. I had visited the bank earlier that day. The teller recognized me. She always wore red lipstick, a shade too bright for morning, and asked how I'd been. I nodded, signed the forms, and closed every investment account I had built over 4 decades. I transferred everything to an anonymous charitable trust. The title on the form read North Hollow Senior Protection Fund. My name appeared nowhere on it. No ceremony, no press release, just funds meant to be used by those no one believed until it was too late. "You don't want recognition," the manager had said, tapping the paperwork. "There's nothing left to recognize." In the envelope I left with Henry was also a sealed letter. The kind of letter you write more with the silence between sentences than with the ink itself. I had folded it in thirds, like the letters I used to pack with Evan's lunch when he was 7 and still let me butter his bread. The handwriting wavered slightly. "You don't need to know when I forgave you. Just know that I lived beyond a cut you didn't mean to cause, but didn't stop either. I don't need you to explain any more. But if you choose to live differently, let it be seen, not said. No signature, just my initial. I didn't leave it at his door. I mailed it. No return address." The cabin took longer to empty than I'd expected. There were only 6 shelves, but each held layers, recipes, scarves. I never wore a fishing hat of his that still smelled faintly of cedar. I gave most things away at the Linden Hollow Donation Center. No one asked my name. I sold the cabin quietly. A retired couple from Oregon bought it after seeing one photo. They said it reminded them of their honeymoon, and I didn't have the heart to say it had been my undoing and my shelter both. The RV was smaller than I'd imagined, but it moved. I named it Marble after the town my mother had grown up in, but never returned to. I painted a single gold stripe down the side using an old stencil set I found at the thrift store. When I turned the ignition that first morning, there was no applause, just the soft sound of tires turning away from what had already ended. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Each stop became a page in a new kind of journal, not written in ink, but in receipts tucked into drawers in vegetables, bought at roadside markets, in brief conversations with people who didn't need to know my story to smile at me. In one town, I taught a free class on writing wills at the library. In another, I showed an older woman how to set up 2-step verification on her phone. No one knew my name. They didn't need to. I didn't want to be thanked, only useful. I kept one photograph. It was taken on Wildridge Peak. My husband had set the timer and propped the old camera on a rock. I stood next to him, hand on his forearm, both of us wearing hats too wide and smiles too small for the moment. The edges had curled slightly in the years since, but I kept it tucked in the RV's cabinet above the stove. When I returned to Wildridge, I didn't knock on the gate or ask to see the new owners. I parked halfway down the trail and walked the last mile alone. The air smelled of dry pine and distant rain. The bench where he used to read had been replaced with something newer, but the view hadn't changed. I placed a small stone near the edge, flat gray, about the size of a child's palm. I had etched it myself, slowly, with the old carving tool he once used for leather. It read, "No one can steal what has already become memory." I didn't linger. Back in the RV, I took off my shoes and rubbed the spot where my left ankle always tightened. I looked at my hands. They bore the shape of time, not loss. I poured tea into the chipped white cup from the cabin, the same one I'd taken on the night I left, not for sentimental reasons, but because it fit my hand best. I remembered something my sister once told me after our father's funeral. "You didn't cry loud enough," she'd said, looking at me like I was broken in the wrong places. "That's why people think you're fine." Maybe that was true. Or maybe I had just learned that the loudest grief is sometimes the least heard. I looked at the cup steam curling upward, catching in the thin crack along the rim. I didn't move to drink it. I didn't move at all. Some endings don't require a door to close, only the choice not to return, and I had made mine. I used to think redemption came with ceremony, some great unraveling or apology that made things neat. But neatness was never part of real life. Not in the folds of a sun-faded cardigan, not in the bitter edge of tea left too long to steep. My chair is old but doesn't creak. I bought it from a roadside sale in Vermont 2 towns back. There was no price tag. The man just looked at me and said, "Name your worth." I gave him $5. He didn't count it. That's how I knew it would hold. Most afternoons, I bring the copper kettle outside, boil water over the small gas flame, and pour into the same chipped mug from the cabin. The crack along the handle looks deeper now. I keep using it anyway. Once a month, I write letters. The envelope only reads LW. I tell no stories about myself. I ask how their tomatoes are growing, if their hips ache when it rains, if anyone has dared call them sweetheart in a tone they didn't appreciate. I don't expect replies, but they come. From women with names like Virginia, Rowena, Elaine. The letters are always written in cursive that dips slightly to the right, like someone leaned a little too long into patience. Evan sends messages every few weeks. "Mom, my hands smell like bleach. Just cleaned my own bathtub." Another time I figured out that old chili recipe. It's better without shortcuts. And no new job yet. Still waking up early, that's something. I never answer. But I read each one twice. He came in person once. Not long ago, no announcement. Just a knock that sounded like someone still unsure if they belonged on the other side of a door. I didn't say anything when I opened it. He didn't either. His eyes looked heavier, not just tired, but quiet. In his hands, a plastic pot. Soil still damp, a single lavender plant just starting to bloom. He didn't offer explanations. He didn't look around to see if I'd made a home here. He just said I remembered this scent. "You used to keep one near the sink." I moved the pot to the step beside my chair. We sat for a while. I watched his shoe tap the dirt. He watched a bird skim the edge of the lake. "I'm not asking you to forget," he said. "I just want to figure out how to be your son again. Properly this time." He didn't wait for a reply. That's how I knew he meant it. I kept the lavender. I watered it the next morning with leftover tea. The letters from women stopped mentioning Chelsea by name. Now they mention themselves. A woman wrote he used to hide the car keys, and I used to pretend not to notice. Another said, "My own daughter told me I was forgettable." Not forgotten, just forgettable. There's a difference. I don't offer solutions. I only write. It is not your fault that silence became your safest option, or sometimes just still here. Today, I received a letter from someone new. Her name was Emily Chen. She wrote on thick stationery, lilac tinted. No return address. "I don't know who you are," it read, but I read about the case. About the woman who documented everything, who made no speeches but still changed the course of things. They didn't print your name, but I needed you to know. Because you said nothing, I finally said something. I told my stepmother to leave. She added at the end in smaller print, "I'm 26. I never thought I'd be brave before 30. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my journal between a pressed leaf and a list of grocery prices from May. I picked up my pen. On a new page, I wrote, "You don't need anyone to call you a victim or a survivor. You only need to remember that tomorrow is still yours." Then I set the pen down. I don't keep photographs on display anymore. Not because they hurt, but because they no longer explain anything. I keep one folded in my drawer, me and my husband standing beside a truck that barely ran, both of us looking like we hadn't slept, but had still chosen each other that day. Sometimes I think about what he'd say if he were here now. Probably something like, "You don't owe anyone your peace. Just keep it where it can't be traded." I planted nothing permanent this time. No tomatoes, no rosemary, not even a bird feeder. I've learned that what grows doesn't always stay rooted. I keep seeds in a tin. I'll plant them when I stop somewhere long enough not to count the days. Someone once told me that healing looks like flowers. I think it looks more like unused scissors kept nearby, but untouched. The copper kettle whistles again. I pour slowly, watching the steam rise. The cup doesn't hold heat as long anymore, but I do. Evan hasn't written this week. I don't wonder why. The wind is soft. A bird lands on the step beside the lavender. Doesn't stay long. That's fine. Not everything has to linger. I think about the stone I buried at Wildridge, the words etched with a camping knife. No one takes what became memory. It's still there beneath pine needles next to a trail no one walks anymore. The sun casts long shadows across the grass. My chair holds. The cup rests easily in my palm. The kettle cools beside me. There is nothing I need to prove, nothing left to explain, and no one watching is the surest sign I did it right.